Welcome to the Holiness Today podcast. On this episode, I have a conversation with Kevin Jack, lead pastor at Church for the One, Highland Park in Lakeland, Florida. In this conversation, we discuss the ministry he's engaged in, his recent article for Holiness Today, and some of what he'll be preaching on at M25. So how are you doing this morning?
I'm great, man. Yeah, busy day, but all good.
And you are down in Lakeland, Florida, if I remember correctly. Is that
Yep.
correct? Yeah.
Yep, where it is a wonderful 81 degrees currently.
Good for you. You guys had some, it was cold down there a little bit recently, wasn't it?
And it's funny in Florida because like when it hits 40 degrees, everybody acts like the world is over. Like people
Yeah.
literally walking around like hats, mittens, all of it. It's just like,
Well, does it ever get cold enough? I mean, obviously 40 is not cold enough, but does it ever get cold enough, maybe like up in Tallahassee or Jacksonville where you need plow trucks or anything like that? Because I imagine there's just no infrastructure for that. Extremely
not
rare.
that if there is a dust of snow on the ground, people act like the world is ending.
It's just over. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Which is quite hilarious.
You grew up did you grow up in Ohio? Are you from Ohio?
Yeah.
I saw that okay. So you're used I grew up in Michigan, and I mean, we have two seasons, winter and then a day of summer basically. So
Yep. 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 That's exactly right.
so you're used to that. But we had that huge dust up here in Kansas recently, and it is because if they don't get the salt on the road, you recognize really quickly that these cars can't handle, some of that, but
Yep.
pretty crazy stuff. Well, if you don't mind, just to get started, how did you find yourself in Florida? How did God kind of call you down there, and how you came to be in the position you are in, if you don't mind?
Yeah. I mean, so I've pastored three places. I was in Maysville, Kentucky, where I was a youth pastor and then a church planner in that area. And then I didn't have language for it at the time, but I was being released from my call before I knew where I was going to go to. Now I have language for it. At the time, it just felt like depression and frustration, but now I get that. Uh, and then went to a church in just outside of Dayton, Ohio, which is really close to where I grew up. There was Beaver Creek Church of the Nazarene and is now Be Hope Church. And they have been in about a 10-year decline in attendance and other pieces. And so was part of that transition there. And after about 5.5 years there, we loved it, thought we would be there forever. But I got a call from the district superintendent down in Florida that said, hey, if the pastor ever left, I told you you'd be my first call. Pastor was my good friend, Brett Rickey. Now, hilariously, I didn't realize this. I have been down to speak at Highland Park for like 4 straight years during the summer. And I just assumed Brett had a bunch of people come down and speak. And it wasn't until I was in the interview process that I saw what the honorarium was in the budget for the guest speaker and saw it was exactly what they had paid me. And I called Brett up and I was like, what's going on? I thought you had a bunch of guest speakers. And he goes, nah, man, you were my succession plan all along.
That is hilarious.
I'll just bank it on you. So through some amazing things and God's clear direction, we made the move to Florida.
In your journey, where I guess all of them, God called you to, but what do you find to be the most challenging? New start churches, kind of revitalizing, or share a little bit on that journey.
Yeah, transition's the hardest. And I would say the thing that I've been encouraged by is I've learned how to build it better, faster, that is more sustainable over the time, and how to really utilize like what are aspects of it that really serve as a church's DNA, vision and values and mission and core pieces of the strategy. So I would say at each piece, from planting a church from an existing congregation. Then in Ohio, it took us about 3.5 years to learn how to transition to then hear what was Highland Park, what is now Church for the One. But that piece is the hardest. It's much easier to make all your own mistakes as a church planner and figure it out than it is to transition something that's already there.
We'll be right back with the rest of this episode. But did you know you can receive credit for listening to Holiness Today podcasts? Holiness Today podcasts qualify for lifelong learning with the Church of the Nazarene. To register for lifelong learning, simply go to learning.nazarene.org. The Lifelong Learning Registry provides Nazarene ministers the opportunity to record and report their efforts to develop and maintain a pattern of lifelong learning. Every Nazarene minister is encouraged to engage in a variety of lifelong learning activities. The code for Holiness Today podcast will be listed in the show description. This code can be utilized for this episode and any previous episode you wish to listen to. Thank you for being a listener and sharing in the ministry of the Church of the Nazarene. Now back to the rest of your episode. So what does that look like when you start a transition with the church? What are the dirty details of that? How does that work? It's the old analogy of moving the piano all at once versus moving it an inch at a time, but is that kind of what it's like there?
Yeah, so I use the analogy that I use is imagine you're on a subway or any like transit system. And what is happening is people are typically they hold on to something. They hold on to a pole, a bar, something in the air that they can grab onto. And where transition fails is we ask them to let go of the thing that they're holding on to before they take hold of the next thing. And there's a reason why people resist because it feels so unsteady and uncertain. And so, what that really looks like, I've learned over time, is the thing that you transition before anything changes in what people see or interact with. The thing that has to transition is what they value. And that if you can shift them from holding on to the old value to holding on to a set of new values, then anything that you actually change that is functional makes sense because they already care about it and they're moving that direction. So it's really if you can create a heart shift in the culture before you shift or transition anything visually or strategically, it works way better.
So in a sense, I would imagine some of that comes out of proclamation, preparing your congregation with that missional statement. But you know, one of the things that you just wrote for Holiness Today, the transforming power of evangelism. But you talk about the difficulty of getting people moving in that direction and rethinking things. But share a little bit how God has placed that on your heart, and what that looks like from a
Yeah.
preaching standpoint.
Well, if I could start, so I have a guy in our congregation. He's a great thinker, and he's sending me texts all the time, and I love it. And one of the things he texted me the other day, he said, "I want you to know we'll follow you anywhere as long as you're willing to go there first." In the sense of like, don't ask us to be what you're not willing to be. We're willing to be whatever you're willing to be. Obviously, with some like orthodoxy and belief pieces in mind on the anywhere. There's some caveats that weren't there in the text. So, I would say that from the preaching proclamation standpoint, one of the things that I've just strived to do that I think is changing in our culture is one of the words that was used that we still use and we should quit using it when it comes to preaching is we use the word authenticity, that people really need to be authentic. And I think the culture that we're in demands a higher level of that than most people are willing to give. And the word I use is not authenticity. The word I use is transparency. Authenticity is I'm willing to be real. Transparency is I'm not hiding anything. I want you to know exactly what's going on. And so one of the pieces that I talk about to our congregation is when I was in high school, I invited my best friend to church because he was asking questions about God. And I did not know how to lead him in real conversations about God. So I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I invited him to church. And he was bored out of his mind. Like started in the middle of the sermon, pulled out the hymnal because we had hymnals, saw all the patriotic songs at the back of the hymnal, which who knows why on earth we have all the patriotic songs at the back of the hymnal. And he started trying to sing God Save the Queen in the middle of the sermon, softly, but loud enough to be heard. And it was funny. And he was bored out of his mind and he never came back. And I just had this real crisis of to go like, man, I thought what I was supposed to do was bring my friend to church, but my church actually has nothing to offer my friend who doesn't know Jesus. And he would actually have to go through some rigorous discipleship before he could gain anything out of what was taking place in a church service. And so that for me, that was a real crisis because it was a matter of, do I leave the church behind because the church isn't doing what I feel like it's called to do, or do I lean into it heavy and ensure that no one feels like my friend felt, or to be honest with you, feels like I felt in that moment because I was embarrassed about what was taking place. It's one of the things that's maybe a little different that I share with our church often is say like I don't feel like I was called to be a pastor. Maybe like I was called to the role. I wasn't called to the role. I was called to make a difference in the kingdom. And I feel the call of God that He's put on my life is to take as many people as far into the kingdom as I possibly can. And so I want our church to be that. And so one of the things that we've done as a church, and this was true in Ohio, and it was a game changer for us, and now it's true in Lakeland, Florida, is we have said that the central symbol of our community is baptism. That we want baptism to be the thing that is celebrated over any other thing. And this for me is just a reminder that as a church, we are here for the transformation of lives. And we'll talk about like to edify the saints or to witness to the non-believer. We are here to see God transform lives. And that when we participate in that process, it does something to our faith that nothing else can. But that really, like from my heart and spoken, comes out in 1,000 different ways because I'm not trying to hide anything. I want them to know exactly what I'm about and why I'm in this thing.
And from that, baptism being an inauguration, how do you help disciple people along and kind of discern where they fit in the kingdom? How God has put a specific call in their life to lead in mobilizing, not just the 1%, but the 98% in the pews.
Beautiful. Nate, it's like we scripted this questions in advance and had them out perfectly,
I
which
promise you, we did not do that. No, just kidding.
we
So
did
go ahead.
not. Just so anyway. So I was so it's funny the way in which like we form our philosophy and we form our theology. We always form it somewhat from what we've experienced that's good. We also form our theology and philosophy from what we've experienced that is bad.
Yeah,
And so
certainly.
I would just say one of the other critical moments in my life is I knew from what the church I grew up in preached and proclaimed, I knew what I was saved from. I knew what God had freed me from. Now, to be clear, I was a church kid, so I knew what He spared me ever from going through. I don't have the prodigal story. My friends in college used to tease me. They go, "You're going to be a terrible pastor." I was just like, "Wait, whoa, why am I going to be a terrible pastor?" They said like, "Because you don't have that story when your sermon's going bad of like, I woke up in a gutter after an all-nighter. Like you don't have that." I was like, "You're right. I don't have that story." But I knew from teaching and from explanation, I knew what I was saved from. Something changed in my life when I realized that no one had told me what I was saved for. That I wasn't just saved from avoiding all this stuff. I was saved for a reason, and that I got to participate in the kingdom and actually do something that mattered for eternity on that side. As I say, like, so part of my heart is to make sure that no one feels how I felt or my friend felt when they were disconnected. But the other piece of it is like something in your faith comes alive when you realize not just that eternity matters, but that your life matters and what you're doing right now actually makes a difference. So we have a process, and it's relatively quick process that we take people through that is about, and it's just we call it claim because our mission is we want to help people experience community, encounter God, claim purpose, and pursue their calling. So claim is about claiming their purpose, and we view it as that you're able to claim your purpose when you claim three things. When you claim your identity of what God's done, when you claim God's purpose and what He's doing in the world, and when you claim your gifting, which is the role you play within God's purpose. And they all work together and they're pretty important because if I claim my gifting and God's purpose, but don't claim the identity of what God has done on my behalf, I'm always going to try to prove myself. And I'm going to have a works based righteousness that is focused on what I do and not what God has done. If I claim my identity and my purpose and my gifting, but not God's purpose, I'm going to make it about me. and I'm going to make it about my life. If I claim God's purpose and my identity, but I don't claim my gifting, I'm going to be a bystander. I'm not going to be involved in what he's doing. But when I claim all three, I realize that God is doing this bigger thing. And in light of what he has done on my behalf and what he has gifted me, that I have a role to play. And so we do most of our discipleship as a church through our serving teams because we believe that it is as people are engaged in the mission of what God is doing that is actually the best environment to have conversations about cultivating their relationship with God and taking a step forward in their relationship with Jesus.
I would assume that for those connecting with your church, well, I just use the word connecting, but it's a great way to interconnect and to get to know
Yes.
people. I mean, I've been to situations where everyone's getting together and you're supposed to speak and talk to people and you kind of become a wallflower. But if you're there for a shared purpose, I
Yes.
imagine that community development takes place through those service teams as well.
And the part, Nate, that I love so much about it is um, typically in church, when we create community, we group people based upon their similarity. Just like you guys are all in this phase of life. You're all singles, you're all young marrieds. And we end up linking up people who look very similar to each other and have the same struggles. And I think what that does is we lose the dynamic impact of the actual diversity of the church. That when we connect people based upon their gifting will be connected across very different phases of life. And so, like, one of our teams really does a lot of our activation pieces. And I was just meeting with a leader over lunch right before we recorded this. He's going, I love our team. I've got two college students. I've got two young people who are singles. I've got two senior adults who have grandkids, and they come over to my house every month, and we love each other and we love the community. And it's that piece that, like, that doesn't happen when we ask people to connect around people who are like them.
So when you work with that, do you have now I'm playing with both words here, calling and vocation, and obviously those are similar words, in meaning. But do you have some conversations around, you're in the medical profession or you're a lawyer or you're a teacher. God's not calling you out of that, but he's
Correct.
giving you a call to be a disciple and he's going to use you in that. What does that shape out? How does that look in Lakeland?
Yeah. So I think one of um, I wholeheartedly believe that ministry is not a church activity, that ministry is an all of life activity, that is everything that we're doing. But one of the things that I've found and just seen is to say, like, the church really becomes the training grounds for the rest of life. And when I say training grounds, I don't mean classroom, I mean experience. Is it like I want people praying for people at all times in all places? I want you, if there's a need, to pause and pray in a restaurant, in the middle of your office, no matter where it is, in your neighborhood, by the driveway. But if you don't, like, the best place for you to learn how to pause and pray for someone is at church because they would expect that. And so one of the things I found is that if we can get people to engage in lifestyle activities of ministry within our local congregation, they're far more likely to engage in those pieces in the rest of life. If you're able to interact in the lobby and make a friend and invite someone out to eat, you're far more likely to be able to engage in a relational style of evangelism within your workplace. And so to really use that environment of the church to get people to begin participating in the ministry activities that should be embedded in all of who they are in their lifestyle.
In the article, you've written about how evangelism can kind of be uncomfortable, but I'm sure you got many stories. But what's a good story of when you've maybe guided someone along into evangelism? I mean, I'm thinking about my conversation earlier with Sam Barber about discipleship and discipleship first and all that. But in that moment when God's speaking to the person as they're sharing an evangelism, what does that look like? I'm sure you've probably had to coach people along on that, disciple people along on that. But if you could share a
Yeah.
little bit.
So first, if I could share failure is we have a larger church down here. We have a little over 2,000 people who are part of our weekend worship services. Um, I have shared the gospel to several people who already go to my church,
Yeah.
and I didn't know it.
Yeah.
And if anything makes you a little shy and uncomfortable on sharing the gospel, it is witnessing to people who you are already their pastor.
That's
And it's
funny.
been good. So they've stopped me a couple of those times, like, "Hey, pastor." It was like, ah, I see what's happening on here. If we're talking like examples walking people through, um, I'd say like my personal just pieces that I've looked through is I need places in which I'm interacting with people who don't go to church. That if I'm saying like, oh, I'm available, but I'm not putting myself in position to be relationship, I'm not actually that available on there. So I've usually found that to be through sports has been my best avenue. Um, I have in every area we've lived in, I've had a group of guys that play basketball at 6 a.m. I found that 6 a.m. basketball is way better than nighttime basketball because at 6 a.m., everyone's just happy to be there and not be injured. If you play basketball at night, people have this like pent up energy and tension from the workplace and their family all day. And I don't want to get into all that mess. That's not a good environment for ministry.
You might not shoot any better at 6 a.m., but you're not aware of it at least. So
That's exactly right. We're just happy to be there. So most of that for me has just been, hey, being there, being available, asking guys what's going on in their lives because there's kind of an expectation that people just show up, we know each other's names, but we don't know anything about each other's lives. And so I'll start asking about what's going on in their lives, and then as they share concerns, I'll just simply say, "Hey, can I pray for you?" No one has ever told me no, that I can't pray for them. And then I follow that up real simply. I say, hey, could I just pray with you right now? And once I've gotten the yes on it's okay on to pray for them, the follow up yes is usually pretty quick. Now, what that does is it creates a context in which they understand that I really care. I don't just want to show up and hang out with them. I actually care about them and I care about their life. Now, for me, honestly, I just let that conversation go based upon their terms. Some people do nothing with it and they're just there and I just keep asking them and they never ask other questions and that's fine. Other people want to immediately come back to me and share the impact of my prayer upon their life. And when that's happening, I understand there's an open door and we take the conversation further. Some pastors view their role as a pastor as a deficit towards evangelism. I view it as a strength. I'm grateful. Now, I understand, like sometimes people get a little weird when they understand I'm pastor. It's easier when I'm playing basketball and they're used to me as a normal person. And so, one of the things I'll do if there's follow up questions, I was like, hey, let's get lunch. And when we get lunch, I, I'm just really forward and I say, hey, you know, I'm a pastor. And so, you know, I have some beliefs about what is best for your life and what I want, what is best for you. I'd love to share that with you. Are you comfortable with that? So I'm never just trying to force it upon them. I'm always giving them options in the process, but I'm going to be really clear that I have good intentions for them. And I'm going to be clear on what I desire for their life.
well, you got a great line, a great paragraph, I guess, but I'll read it really quickly. It says, I know we're not supposed to bring people to Jesus. We're supposed to bring Jesus to people. I agree. At the end of the day, here is my concern. We've become so theologically astute at all the ways we're not supposed to do evangelism that we've created a belief system that entirely excuses ourselves out of the work that God has commanded us to do. It's a great
There we
line.
go.
I read that and I thought, and I think there's an old Dwight Moody story where he's sharing the gospel and his board member comes up to him and says, I think you're doing it wrong. And he says, you might be right. How do you do it? And I'm sure I butchered the story there, but there's a certain practicality and pragmatism in evangelism that emerges in your life. But you mentioned basketball, but as you work with your congregation, I'm assuming you're encouraging them in that. But do you have any good stories or success stories where you have evangelists that are in the pews, kind of going out and doing these things?
Oh my word. There's um hundreds. And I would say all of it comes from that line in the piece. Paul's got the part in his letter in Philippians in the first chapter. where he gives the note of he's like, some preach Christ out of selfish ambition and dishonest gain. They do it to increase the pain in my chains. That's a very loose translation, just to be clear. But then he gives a follow-up note and he goes, but what do I care? All I care is that in every way Christ is preached. And I would just say that I was taught so many ways to do evangelism wrong that it was paralyzing to me. And no one ever actually taught me how to do it right. They just told me how to blow it. And when we just do that, we don't give people a pathway forward. And we're actually given the opposite of what Paul says, because he says, listen, if you have to do it wrong, do it wrong. All I care is that you do it. So one of the beauties within our congregation is one of the languages we use is we say, you don't need permission from us to do what God is calling you to do. It doesn't mean we're going to announce it. It doesn't mean we're going to put it in the bulletin. That doesn't mean we're going to put it on the website. But you don't need our permission to go do it. And so we had a guy in our congregation. His name's Brad. He's a phenomenal guy. He was baptized a year ago. Powerful moment of transformation in his life. He started sharing the gospel with a friend who's in Georgia. Walked through some difficult moments with him. Him and a pastor from our church actually drove up to Georgia. So this is like 7 hour drive because his friend wanted to get baptized and couldn't make his way down to Lakeland. So they drove up and baptized him in Georgia. And Brad, on the way back, one of our pastors was talking to him, and the friend challenged him and said, hey, I challenge you to lead 20 men to Jesus this year, to lead 20 men. And I think he's at eight. That he's now had eight friends who he has directly witnessed to, shared his story, shared the gospel, entered them into church. They've been baptized, and now they're serving in a part of the ministry.
Wow.
And I just go, man, I know pastors who haven't led eight people to Jesus in their whole life.
Yeah.
And we've got this
Yeah.
guy who's so passionate. That's where he's at right now.
Yeah. Well, this episode should be coming out. I'm hoping to get it up on Thursday, so before M25. And you
Awesome.
are plenary speaker number 4, if I looked at that correct. But give
Number
us a
four.
little snapshot. Give us a little foreshadowing of what your sermon's going to be about.
Yeah, so I want to talk out of Luke chapter 8, which is the parable of the soils. And one of my pieces is I don't think the soils were meant to be an exhaustive metaphor about all the conditions in which we could do ministry in. Like he talks about good soil, rocky soil, and thorny soil. There is no sand, there is no other pieces. I don't think Jesus was meant to be exhaustive. And so, what I want to do is I want to spend the first period of time and the main focus of it sharing the ways in which culture has changed and how evangelism looks different based upon the acceptance of Christianity in that culture, and how whether or not Christianity is viewed as the dominant worldview changes how we should actually functionally approach within evangelism, but even more so within how we lead our congregations.
Have you found in Lakeland that doing evangelism, obviously you're still in the United States, but is different than Ohio? And then if there's any differences across state lines, probably very similar, is there differences when I think about people, when I think about the passage of loving your enemy versus loving your neighbor, obviously both are tough. But sometimes I would say that I don't have too many enemies. Enemy becomes this kind of, oh, yeah, I'm supposed to love those evil people that are doing this evil thing over there.
Yeah.
And it's easier to love them. The challenge I find is the loving your neighbor portion in the sense when I think about it literally as the people I live in an apartment that are down in the down the street from me or just down down the hallway from me. That was a long preface of saying I would assume in Florida and Ohio both being this situation that when you run into people, they've probably got a good grasp of who Jesus is, even if they're not going to church, even if they're not following Christ. But evangelism in the context of telling people that maybe need to be remembered back into the body of Christ, that kind of maybe had, I don't even know if I'd say falling away because I'm going to the soil analogy. Maybe it didn't take root, So
Yeah,
what does that look like for you?
that's beautiful. Well, I think it's interesting because I think one of the main distinctions slash opportunities that we have in the current culture is we kind of have three categories of people. We have an older generation that grew up when Christianity was still dominant.
Yeah.
And so there is an assumption of understanding the gospel. There is another generation that, while many are in church, many are not in church, that they have church experience and then discarded it. And that church largely falls under the category of hashtag church hurt, is where they
Mhm.
fall. I'm not part of the church, not because
Yeah.
of apathy or even agnosticism. It's because the church is corrupt and there's leaders who shouldn't be there. And so I don't trust the church. It was very like I grew up in that. It's a very cool to be. I'm spiritual, but not religious.
Right.
All
Right.
that. But then there's a third category, and it's really the second category is kids, and the third category actually has no church experience whatsoever.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to go as you're looking at what's taking place with the younger generations. There's actually no exposure to the gospel.
Yeah.
There's no exposure to church that they don't even realize. We had someone come in our church recently that we just put out a sign that everyone's welcome. And he goes, I didn't know I was welcome.
Hmm.
Now, as someone who grew up in church and was on that sliver of church dominance, that's crazy to me. And so it's just really interesting that based upon who you're interacting with, your approach becomes very, very different based upon their experience.
Are you finding that in category three that, and I guess I'm speaking from my own context here a little bit, but I
Yep.
find that there's a longer discipleship period, perhaps from someone who's been in church but is not going, than there is from someone who's grasping it for the first time. I don't know if
You're,
so almost in a sense, category two is a longer discipleship model than category three. And we can't formulaic everyone out. I get that, but generally speaking, when you
I
look at the
agree
categories.
entirely with what you're saying. But largely the work becomes different. I preached a message just yesterday. It's Monday when we're recording this. Um, and the message I preached yesterday was on Jesus walking with the disciples while they were on the road to Emmaus. And I was approaching from the category that we had done this series on how does Jesus engage those who are done doubting or disengaged from faith. And my recognition is that these two men were done and that they weren't so much walking towards Emmaus as they were walking away from Jerusalem
Yeah.
because Jerusalem was the last place that they were with Jesus. And so the question I've been asking is, what does Jesus say to those who were done with faith? And if you actually look at the text, it's hilarious. It's like, what does Jesus say? He says, "What things? What are you talking about? How foolish you are." I was like, that's probably not a great approach for building our ministry to those who are done. And so the thing that came to me that was far more profound that I realized in the moment is these men were walking away from Jesus. And what does Jesus do? He walks with them, that he walks with those who were walking away from him. And so I would say that third category, it's more theological work because you've got to build a belief system in place where there wasn't one. That second category of church hurt, it's relational work. It's faithfulness and presence that sustains even in the midst of objections and struggles. So it very much can be longer, but it's very different work that we do in those spaces.
Now, on the discipleship side of it, working with believers in your church, do you find that you have to push them out of a comfort zone? I'm kind of going to another reference between intro and extroverts. Being an
Let's
introvert
go.
myself, I constantly have to push myself out of comfort zones. But what is that like? You mentioned that this particular member won't go as far as you've gone, but I assume you're also pulling them to places that maybe they wouldn't normally go as well. But what's that look like for you?
I want to acknowledge first for any especially younger pastor who is still forming their philosophy and approach. What I am saying probably should not be practiced. Okay. So like
Warning.
there's like, yeah, don't learn from me. I'm only answering what I do on this. And I say this partially that my call was to lead as many people as far into the kingdom as I possibly can. I don't have time for people who play church. I don't have time. I'm not going to mess around with stuff. I'm going to be really clear on what God is leading us into and the call that he has on people's lives. Partially because I don't have time, partially because I don't want people to waste their life spinning their
Yeah.
wheels on stuff that doesn't matter. I probably say too often, if you're not growing in your faith, then we're not the community for you.
Yeah.
I say too
Yeah.
often, if you're unwilling to be challenged and confronted, then we're not the place for you. Go find a place that's going to be happy to have you sit. But I am going to be a bother to you until your faith is activated. So
So,
again, not
yes,
encouragement to do that.
personally speaking, are there areas of your life, as God has been calling you, where you're like, God, I'm uncomfortable here. How do I get over this? If you could share any stories there, maybe as you were getting going in ministry, what was the biggest personal challenge where you said, I got to get over this?
Oh man, all of it, Nate. All of it. But
All of
but
the
I think
above.
it's the piece of like say, I wanted my community of faith to be something that I wasn't. I wanted them to be to be passionate in worship, but I wanted to sit in the back and slide out backstage when it was time for me to preach. I wanted them to bring their friends, but I wanted them to bring their friends so I didn't have to. As I would just say, like, all of it has been painful and all of it has been stepping outside my comfort zone. But that realization of I can't lead people to a place that I'm unwilling to go has been the thing that has been the catalyst for my own faith more
Hmm.
than anything else.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's many, but if you could identify in scripture, is there any one biblical character that you've said this guy is kind of who this is who I kind of identify with, or this is an inspiration? Obviously Jesus, but any Bible heroes in there that you kind of identify with?
So I read, this is probably 6 years ago. I read N.T. Wright's biography of Paul.
Yeah.
So after all his theological works, he wrote like, "Hey, I just want to give you this is Paul's life." And he wrote in this last chapter, he said, "What?" And he makes the case that Paul is the most influential person to walk the face of the earth other than Jesus himself. Like no one's writings have been more widely distributed. No one has shaped thought further than the Apostle Paul did. And he gives this description at the end. And he says, "What made Paul Paul?" And he said, three things. First, his relationship with God and the intimacy of his relationship with God and his full trust in God. He said, second, his I forget the exact word he used, so I'm going to make one up, but it was just like his contrarianism. He's like, we think we would like Paul. He goes, we probably won't. Paul, in one moment, tells the governor he's not governing right, then tells the ship captain he should not be sailing at this time, and then tells the church everything he's doing wrong. He's like,
Right.
Paul
Right.
had no problem being disagreeable and telling people where they should be. And then he gives the third category, and he said, in every startup company, there is someone who is unwilling for it to fail. And he said, the church wasn't going to fail, but if you watch Paul's life, his pace is relentless and he is unwilling to stop. And I remember reading those three pieces and thought, I probably don't have the relationship with God that Paul does, but I could be as disagreeable if I need to be. And I absolutely can match his work ethic.
Yeah.
And I don't have a fear of getting outworked because I care less than that. And so it was this moment of realization for me of to say, like, I think sometimes we deify Paul because he's in the Bible and he wrote so much of it. But the realization of to say, this is an ordinary man who the gospel took hold of him and the world was different because of it. And I just thought, man, if I let the gospel take hold of me in a similar way, I wonder what God would be willing to do.
So on now, do you have to force yourself to rest then?
Uh,
I,
actually,
do you find yourself to be a little bit of a workaholic, or because when you read through Paul, I'll put
oh
it this
yeah,
way, I feel like Paul, and I'm a sucker for audio anyway, but I feel like Paul is better audibly because you kind of get the ranty
yes,
feeling where he's going,
yes,
ah, da, da, da,
I'm
like you
with you.
say,
I'm
yeah,
with you.
poking at stuff. But yeah, how do you tell yourself to rest? How do you make that happen?
No, it actually, strangely enough, that's not a struggle for me.
Yeah.
And just from the standpoint of, uh, I am, I am by nature a homebody, and I love my family and I love my kids. And we have my wife and I, we have four kids. They are 8, 10, 12, and 14. And if I could do anything in the world, I would be at home just hanging out with them, playing stupid games and doing whatever else we can do. And so, as committed as I am to the church and its work and what God is doing there, man, I rush home because I view that as the most like there's no greater legacy I will leave and no more impactful work than I will have than raising my family and spending time with those four tiny humans.
Yeah, that's good. So, what's your favorite board game? You guys play board games, or what kind of games you play?
We play we're in Florida, so we swim all the time, which is fantastic. And I throw the football in the pool while my kids jump in until my arm's about to fall off. We play a lot of games on the Nintendo Switch. Mario Party is a personal favorite of our family, so it's good.
What's your favorite meal?
Oh, Nate, don't ask me that. I have the palate of a third grader. I would eat chicken tenders every meal for the rest of my life and be thrilled.
So that if you were on death row, that's what you're choosing is chicken tenders, huh?
Yeah, I had a good friend in Kentucky. He used to tease me. He said, "You realize you get chicken tenders everywhere you go?" And I was like, "No, I don't." And he goes, we go to BW3's, you get boneless wings. That's just adult chicken tenders. We go to the
That's true.
Chinese restaurant, you get sweet and sour chicken. That's just Chinese chicken tenders. I was like, "You're right. I do."
So favorite dessert then? Are you a little more selective on do you have a specific
Uh,
dessert or you got anything kind of thing?
I love like this is gonna sound like I love trash gummy candy. Like gas station, expired, already stale fruit slices. I could not be more in.
It's good. All right, favorite. You mentioned biography of by N.T. Writer Paul, but favorite maybe work of fiction that you've read.
Oh, favorite work of fiction. I don't read much fiction. I read the Harry Potter books with my kids, and that was pretty awesome. And I loved that. I don't read a lot of fiction. I'm in a doctoral program right now, so I read a whole lot of textbooks right now.
You don't have time then to do it.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Where are you doing your doctoral studies at?
I am Southeastern University is literally like 10 minutes from me. And so the president extended an incredibly generous offer when we moved down here. And so I'm able to get to my doctorate at no cost.
That's amazing. And so what
Yeah.
is it going to be in?
So I don't know if this sounds bad. I didn't want to get my PhD in theology from a Pentecostal school. I
Yeah.
figured like that's probably not exactly. So I'm really excited. I'm gonna get a PhD in organizational leadership.
Okay. Yeah. That'll be good.
Yeah,
So
it's
maybe you probably don't have time, as you're saying, to read, but do you have a favorite movie that is your go-to movie
favorite movie.
or
I
TV
mean,
show?
first off, no movies that I can confess on the Holiness Today podcast without being deeply convicted on everything I'm going through.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a careful one. You know, we're not allowed to go to movies until was it 85? I think we switched that
yeah,
up. So yeah,
that's really
yeah,
tricky, Nate, on the movie side.
yeah. I'm trying to get some blackmail on you right now. So
I love all movies. My favorite movies right now are the Dune movies.
yeah, those have been pretty cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those have been fun.
I saw Sicario, which had been out for a long time
Woo!
recently, which was the same director, and he just has a way of. I mean, I think the desert is pretty anyway, but he has a way of making, capturing the beauty of desert
Oh,
scapes and
they
things
are
like that.
beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, those are good movies. Yeah, that's up for a lot of Oscars. We'll see if it gets any this year. I don't know. We'll
Yeah,
see.
that'll be fascinating.
Well, thank you for sharing this time. I really appreciate it, and it's a pleasure. It went by fast, so I want you to be able to plug your podcast. I was going to give it, but I couldn't recall it off the top of my head. But
Yeah.
what's your podcast for people to listen to you, and how often
Well,
do you do it?
we've actually taken a little pause. So we did it. Yeah, we got up to like 380 episodes or something like that. We did it weekly for like 5 years. And I do it with the guy who is now our executive pastor here at Church for the One, and just workload on church and transition pieces that we are working through with planning a campus. was just kind of overload. And so like, hey, we need to take a break from that. So if you want to go back, all the episodes are still on there. It's
Yeah.
20 minutes because everyone has 20 minutes to learn to become a better leader. And it
Yeah.
is the Leading Hope podcast on YouTube.
So you're going to get it going up here at some point in time? You got a plan for that, or?
We don't have a plan yet. We have intentions to do so. We
Yeah.
just heard
Yeah.
this morning about a fire chief who did a weekly leadership group with 100 of his firemen, and that our podcast was the curriculum that he used for 2 years. And he's frustrated because we haven't been doing it, so he doesn't know what to do. So some
So you need
stuff
help.
like that has gone. Maybe we need to kick it back up soon.
And if I'm looking at this correctly, Wednesday, February 12th at 9 a.m., you'll be speaking. Is that right? At
Yep.
M25 in Kansas City?
Yep, that is correct.
Now, here's something to think about. And I gotta figure out the exact day, but if the Chiefs win the Super Bowl, you might be speaking in the middle of the parade. I mean, there might be a parade going on. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure they're thinking about it, but I don't know if they have. But it
I'm
could
sure
be
I'll work some pieces into there. I'll see if
yeah, yeah,
I'll see if Pat and Travis can just make
yeah.
their way through in the midst of
Yeah,
it.
exactly. Just have the parade go right through it. But it should
Yep.
at least 2 years ago when there was a conference in Kansas City, it was right where all of the events were. So you might be right. You might be speaking to all of Kansas City. So fair warning there.
That's
So,
hilarious. Or
so
no one. Everyone
yeah,
will
yeah.
just leave in the
Everyone will
midst
be
of
at
the
the
session
parade.
and
Yeah,
go to the parade.
that's
So
right.
one or the other.
Yeah, is one or the other. Everyone or no one. So just be prepared for that. So, Kevin, it was a blessing to spend this time with you. Thank you so much.
Nate, grateful for you. Great to hang out with you.
Thank you for listening to the Holiness Today podcast. If you enjoyed this production and wish to hear more, visit holinesstoday.org/podcast or find us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts.